Thank you so much for this opportunity. Good morning to all of you. I saw that everyone is awake, engaged. My introduction is nice. You can look it also up in Wikipedia, you can look it up on the internet. But I very much would like to relate to what you said about performing and about pop stars. I'm not a pop star, just to make sure about that. I have become a performer, but actually during my lifetime with the privilege of almost singing the same song about education, the role of education and the importance of education. And now being put in charge of a university is just marvelous to indeed enact, to bring in practice what as a minister I tried to achieve. I was for 5 years also in charge of the World Bank's operations around education, also health and social protection. And now I can do it myself. And then I realize the tremendous challenges and realize that, in my view, the glass is not yet half full. I think in this respect, I think major changes have to occur. And that's actually the kind of presentation I gave as a background. And it's, on the one hand, about content, about what universities should be doing. It's also about organization. Organization of universities, as you know, there are no international universities. Well, there are some, but very, very few. Almost all universities are national universities. In my country, Maastricht University is a Dutch university. It is bound by Dutch law. We have 50% foreign students. We try very much to think about what those students should, say, experience, what kind of learning they should have. And at the same time, we all the time fight with the Dutch law, in the sense that it doesn't give that much leeway. And then we are a university, I think, who tries to do this. And so here, my actually reflection is very much first on content. My reflection on organization is in a book which appears on internet, so we can continue the discussion around these issues. It's called A Chance for European Universities. Yes, I do limit myself to Europe. I didn't want to take on yet the world as a whole. Europe already has sufficient challenges. And there, please participate. It will be on internet. You can participate in the discussion about the future of content and, of course, structure, organization. Because in my view, you can't talk only about a strategy if you also do not spend time on the organization, because the two are related. So what I'll do now is very quickly, because indeed I very much look forward to the debate, to your questions, your interaction. Okay, it was not there. So now from here on, so my title here was chosen as University in the World Without Walls. And by the way, I think congratulations. Celebration, no, maybe not a celebration, but using, I would say, the energy of the remembrance of the falling of the walls, and also what happened after that in terms of thinking about the future. My experience here, on November the 3rd, 1989, I was drawn from the university on, it was actually on November the 1st, I was called while I was giving a lecture tour in Canada. They asked me as an academic to become a minister. They were out of their mind. They should never have done that. I entered government on November the 3rd. On November the 4th, I had my first contact actually with my German colleague, talking about education cooperation. Then on November 8th, 9th, the wall fell. It looked like causality. But the experience on my part was, the Dutch cabinet is in any case a very funny cabinet. All the cabinets are funny. They spend every Friday together. It's collegial decision making. And then the whole morning is spent on international issues. I don't think there's any cabinet in the world who spends so much time on international issues. So we talk a lot about Congo, we talk a lot about any place far away, also about Germany and about the fall of the wall. And then my disappointment, very, very little commitment to what Benjamin Barber said, in the sense of, it's not just about creating freedom, it's not just about giving the support of freedom, it's also maintaining your commitment. I think that's the basic point which is lacking in our Western democracies. We call for freedom, we call for democracy all around the world, and I'd like very much in the discussion to continue on what could be done more in this direction. But first, my major question is, what are the essential skills and competencies which graduates need in order to become new leaders of tomorrow, and how can universities equip them with these skills and competencies? Now, lots and lots of figures are available, and we don't do anything with them. We know in Europe, there have been ample surveys that 80% of our graduates say that they work on a globalized labor market, which means at least once a day they have a contact with someone from another culture, from another language. What happens in universities to prepare students for that kind of world? Not very much. Globalization in the current crisis, I think that is something we have to take at heart in our education system. Indeed, with that troubling way in which globalization presents itself. It's an overwhelming force. And there have been talks about the retreat of globalization during the crisis. Nonsense. We would not be able to maintain our lifestyles with a retreat of globalization. It's not going to happen. Globalization will further take effect. But globalization is also a divisive force, because it's clearly viewed as good for many and not so good for also a very, very large group. And then the challenge to the universities is, of course, to prepare students for that world. And globalized leadership, indeed, the ability to function effectively on that international labor market, but also to create a social cohesion at home, to make sure that indeed there is globalization in a form which is welcomed by everyone, not just by the higher educated who find that they have jobs all over the world. And then the changing societal role of universities, maybe very quickly in retrospect, universities were created in many respects to provide civic leadership. And here I distinguish a bit, maybe it's juxtaposing with what Benjamin Barber said. I do feel that leadership is an issue in countries. It's democracy carried by people, yes, but also democracy carried by people who have had the privilege to have maybe these talents of being in that position of leadership, and have had also the privilege of indeed experiencing the way in which leadership can be built up. And then I feel that the US has done, in many respects, much better than Europe. I feel that that's a challenge for Europe. Where Europe has very much looked, after the Second World War, as education supplies manpower, supplies engineers, supplies lawyers, supplies the kinds of people who can do jobs, not the kind of people who can create a sustainable democratic society and a sustainable development worldwide, including the environment, including worldwide differences in income, including doing away with poverty. And then, so towards new leadership, new challenges for universities. So educate these students, prepare them for work peacefully across cultural and language barriers, where, of course, the Bologna Agreement for Europe has been a tremendous boon. But when Mrs. Hennecott invited me to the European Parliament to speak about the success of Bologna, I said, the glass is not yet even half full. We are not doing well enough, because the Bologna system is still, and then again, structure is nationalized. It's done in individual countries, and that's not going to be very helpful in the next steps. Now, what we try in a very modest way to do in Maastricht, the first thing I always exchange with my colleagues is, how much time do you have to reflect on what you're doing? All universities feel that they are under pressure. They like to make sure that their finances are in order. They like to attract students. They market themselves. They are engaged in all kinds of things. What should they be involved in? They should be involved in thinking about why they are doing these things. And so in this respect, I've tried, and I had some leverage when I came in this University of Maastricht, to have 10% of our budget set aside for innovation. And innovation starts with making, first of all, it's a symbol. 10% of your budget is for thinking about what you should do. And what you should do has to do with what are the needs for students, what are the needs for society, for the kinds of education. First thing is we focused on how to learn and being efficient in learning, efficient in the kind of learning which contributes, and that has led to problem-based learning in all degree courses. It's the only university worldwide which practices this. It's extremely expensive. It's very difficult to maintain this atmosphere, but I think it's working. It has to be multi instead of monodisciplinary. There's no one actually who wants to hire people who are monodisciplinary. Oh yes, it's nice for the HR people when they have someone who's monodisciplinary. But the jobs are all multidisciplinary. They are always on boundaries. And indeed, it is expensive, but it's worth it. But challenge ahead, making more of the potential, truly intercultural education, and how to foster cross-cultural thinking and the development of intercultural competency in the classroom. I stumbled on this in a way in which I found it amazing how little research has been done on what intercultural competency is. Yes, there are some 8 to 10 skills, but still many researchers talk about looking at qualitative aspects. Now, that is fine, but you might as well be explicit and try to translate that. Doesn't have to be, as far as I'm concerned, in skills, but make it explicit what you mean and measure it. And particularly measure the development and look at different ways in which intercultural competencies can be developed. So the necessity for intercultural literacy for all spheres, and indeed, the CEOs of industries should be able to work across cultural boundaries effectively and also particularly effortlessly in a way in which indeed they follow, I would say, not the short-run returns, but the long-run returns in terms of the environment and in other directions. Then the international classroom, we have 50% foreign students, so that gives all kinds of possibilities for an international classroom. But we don't know exactly how to utilize that. Whether we should indeed not make it a more explicit point that you ask the German student to think about the Dutch system of, say, health and reflect on that, and the Dutch student to think about the French system, so that you bring in immediately the cross-cultural experience in terms of social development. So it is something in which further developments have to take place, and there indeed we try to work this out in the form of a project, very much, I would say, stimulated by occasions like this one. So thank you very much for this possibility to introduce this.
Thank you very much, Mr. I think this was an excellent start, and I have a number of questions, but maybe our panelists want to comment already on the presentation.
Yes, well, thank you very much indeed for that stimulating, thought-provoking presentation. Just one or two words, reflections on that. I certainly think that we do need higher skilled global leadership, and that universities certainly have a key role in developing these leadership skills, these intercultural competencies. And I agree that thus far the education system hasn't focused enough on these soft skills, and the content of education seems to be much more around content rather than the skills that are needed in the globalised world. I think, though, that the onus and the responsibility lies throughout the education system, and that these are the kinds of skills and competencies that need to be developed right from primary school. So if we're talking about learning languages, developing social skills and leadership skills, these things can start very early. And I think it's very important that they're nurtured and that the teachers are sufficiently skilled to develop those competencies right from an early age. And I think it's important that universities are building alliances with, on the one hand, the secondary and primary schools so that the curriculum can be streamlined right the way through. And also that universities are increasingly need to build links with other actors in society. So that brings in business, of course, and increasingly we are seeing across Europe stronger links between business and universities as they negotiate the kinds of skills and competencies that are needed, which is very encouraging. There still isn't enough investment, of course, from business in universities, apart from, with the exception of the United States, where there was a huge private investment in university education. So I think, yes, intercultural competence is very important, and it's great to see that Maastricht, you have an international student body. Of course, in the UK, we also have a huge number of international students, 350,000 at the moment, second only to the US in terms of overseas students. And what we are seeing, of course, across the world is increased student mobility. And mobility is the fundamental factor in developing the kinds of intercultural competencies that we need today. The mobility has increased so that we now have about 3 million students studying around the world who not in their country of origin, if you like. Of course, it is US, UK, Germany, France, who are the main recipients of the overseas students. And it seems to me, and the big, the nations that are providing these students are, as you would expect, China, India, Korea, many East Asian students. And so what we're seeing is as more and more students become international, we're seeing that these, we would hope that the ability to get on with each other, the ability to understand other cultures is increasing. What worries me, though, is that the direction of travel is one way. We don't see too many US students going overseas, UK students going to study in other countries. It's increasing, yes, but there doesn't seem to be the same desire on the part of Western European countries to go and learn more about life in Russia, for example. My experience in Russia, we had queues of Russians wanting to come and study in the UK, but we didn't have many British students wanting to go and study in Russian universities, in spite of the huge sort of wealth of experience they could have gained there. So that's a worry, that mobility is happening, but it's one-way traffic. And I think it's really important that, so from a UK perspective, what we're trying to encourage as the British Council is UK students to go overseas more, to learn languages more, so that they can develop the kinds of leadership, intercultural leadership skills that you're talking about, and that are so important. Although, of course, as the British Council, we think that English, English is something that we've taught for 70 years. We also see the use of English, and English as a global language, actually as a threat to the UK, because it does tend to make us lazy in terms of language learning. And so we have some quite big campaigns going at the moment to really get British kids, learning languages, because although in a business situation you might think that it doesn't really matter, everyone speaks English anyway. There's a lot of evidence that's been accumulated to show that you have much more chance of closing your business deal if you speak the language of the person that you're trying to sell to, rather than relying on English. Unfortunately, of course, these days you have to make the economic argument. It's the only one that seems to win. It's no good making the values-based argument, the culture-based argument, by saying, actually, you might learn something. It's important to understand how other people think and feel, and you can do that through learning about languages. So that's certainly something we're very much focused on in the UK, and I think in the US as well. Language learning is certainly a big issue, and is required by the student population. Just one other thing that I'd like to say about education is that in terms of the curriculum, it is quite narrow, and subjects studies, the most common subjects studied at law, as you would expect. Lawyers will never be out of business. Law and business studies are the most common subjects studied. The curriculum at primary and secondary level is fairly narrow, And there doesn't seem to be yet enough emphasis on global citizenship. It's a little green shoots coming about how to live responsibly in society today with all the problems and issues that we have that Professor Barber talked about so well before. And it strikes me that the education system needs to focus a lot more on developing in the children growing up today this kind of how to call it social entrepreneurship type skills, global citizenship type skills, emphasising that it's each individual's responsibility to look after the environment, to solve the issues and the challenges that we face. There are some good examples in universities. So University College London, for example, now has a global citizenship module in its curriculum where children are taught to be open to difference, to be flexible, to appreciate other cultural approaches. But it still seems to me that there isn't enough emphasis on these kinds of skills. What we're trying to do in the British Council is to build networks of young people who really do care about issues, who've already demonstrated that they're activists, and who can come together from different countries to solve society's problems. Because the education system itself, I think has already been said by Professor Barber, you can't rely on the education system to do it. There has to be other civil society networks which actually are much stronger because they represent individuals who come together to solve problems. And one example of one of our networks is the International Climate Champions Network, which is actually young people, 14 to 16 years old, who have demonstrated activism in their local communities. And what we've done as the British Council is simply to bring them all together so they're much more powerful as a force than if they're doing it all in their individual communities. Just one final point is that although I was introduced as the director of the British Council, formerly in Moscow and now in Benelux, and the perception of the British Council is that we promote British culture and teach the English language. Actually, that is still the case, I think, but increasingly we are working in alliances with other European cultural institutes, and we increasingly see this as the most effective way to work. So while our government might not, particularly our future government, might not be particularly pro-European, because the British Council is an arm's length organisation, we're able to work very closely with the Goethe Institute, the Alliance Française, the Istituto Italiano di Cultura, Cervantes and so on, to bring people together from all countries around Europe to solve today's problems. And that's increasingly the way that we want to work, so that rather than promoting UK culture, what we're doing is convening people from different countries to solve issues in parallel to the education system, which of course is very important, but on its own, the education system can't do anything unless the individuals that are a part of it are seeing the need for action themselves. So those are just a few reflections on Professor Ritzen's thing, and thank you very much for giving me this opportunity at ICD to come to this event.
Thank you very much, Martin Hope. So we got a perspective from the Netherlands and we got a perspective from the United Kingdom about what are the priorities and what are the goals to reform, or one would probably also say modernize, the educational system, with, in your presentation, a focus on higher education. Professor Barber talked about the concept of sovereignty and the problem of a nation state to maintain what it is or to preserve traditional developments, including culture, in times of no walls or a time without barriers. So if this approach of modernization is something which is also seen from a capitalist point of view, that the increasing competition of schools like your university or institutions which are not higher education institutions, but they try to create something like the perfect actor in a capitalist environment, which is focusing more on certain skills and human capital, which is less the idea of the Humboldt idea to develop a personal identity and to be part of a specific national culture. Is this the right direction? And is this the appropriate answer of education? Or do we also have to consider what is most likely going to disappear and that we lose something if we expose certain cultural institutions to increased competition? Because that's also a direct consequence of a world without barriers, or in our specific case, you mentioned the Bologna process, a European integration project with a single market without barriers. What is your answer to this?
You've had the opportunity to hear me, so I won't take too long. But let me just say a few words about education in democracy, and particularly in interdependent global democracy. I think we forget in the discussions of education, because education is obviously about preparing people for a life of work and a life of knowledge, that in fact the very idea of the liberal arts, as we call them, was born in the Middle Ages as the arts of freemen. Most people weren't free, they were indentured, and a few were free. And those who were, it was understood, had to be educated into liberty, which is to say, citizens, we may be born free, but we're not born citizens. To be born free says we're born with a right to claim our freedom, but that right will only belong to those who understand the art of citizenship. Otherwise it will remain an abstract and unclaimed right, so that those who are democratic theorists from the very beginning of time, right back to Plato, who wasn't exactly democratic, but certainly a theorist, have argued that education is absolutely crucial to the education of those who are to be citizens. In Plato's case, there would only be a few, the wise, the philosophical, who would be rulers, but they need an education. In democratic societies, the assumption is that the people rule, but that means not simply that you empower the people, but that you educate them for both liberty and freedom. So the question in the United States from the beginning, at the time of the founding, was how do you educate people to be citizens, to create a competency for citizenship? The founders, like Jefferson and John Adams, both agreed that whatever kind of a constitution you wrote, it wouldn't matter if people were not able to exercise the competences and the rights of citizenship. And they, from the beginning, you remember Thomas Jefferson founded the University of Virginia, and John Adams founded a public school system for young men in Massachusetts. And though they disagreed politically, they both agreed that education was absolutely critical to citizenship. And from the time of Jefferson and the University of Virginia, American education has had on its mind the question of education for citizenship and exactly what that means. De Tocqueville talks about the apprenticeship of liberty. I love that phrase, the apprenticeship of liberty. You may be born free, but it's an apprenticeship. You learn how to exercise that liberty and to protect it. And that's been a key function of education. And as we discussed earlier, also the media as an arm of education. The media were supposed to play that role. It's very clear they don't. They don't care. They're not interested. And part of that, and I won't go back to that, is just to remind us that the dominion of commerce and consumerism over the media, but also over education, increasingly undermine the civic mission of universities and of schools in education. But the question I want to just briefly answer is, what are in fact the arts of liberty? The liberal arts are actually the arts of liberty, the arts by which we create, maintain, and sustain our liberty. What are those arts? What does it mean? I mean, does that just mean studying comparative literature and history and so forth? And I would argue that there are certain arts of liberty that are implicit in any civic curriculum that are often overlooked but central to what it means to help make and train citizens, which is perhaps why we have so few citizens in the world today, because these are not arts that are much taught anymore. And perhaps the most important of all is counterintuitive, because I think most of us think you go to school to learn how to talk. And we think of talking, articulation, self-expression as a key to being free. And of course, as a result, our national assemblies are called parliaments. Parliaments of talk, parley. They're places where people come and talk. Lawyers are the chief agents of modern democratic civilization, and If nothing else, they sure know how to talk. Professors like us and so on are talkers. That's what we do well. We're trained to do that. I'm going to suggest that talking is actually an aristocratic or elitist faculty, not directly related to democracy, though it may be related to democratic leadership. But the key egalitarian and absolutely indispensable faculty that citizens need is the ability to listen. And listening is not something that is much taught. Students are forced to listen to professors like us who talk at them, but generally they find ways to use their BlackBerries or their newspapers and not pay too much attention. But on the other hand, they are to some degree forced to listen, but the art of listening, what it means to actually listen, to hear. My wife is an artist, and she often talks about the need not just to listen, but to see. You know, we go to museums, we look at things, but we're so busy pushing our own judgments, our own knowledge of art, that we often don't just stop and look. Look, see, watch. And that capacity to look, to see, and to listen is essential to democracy, because it's by listening to others that we actually find common ground, that we begin to imagine ourselves to be in their shoes, that we see what we share with them, that we hear where they differ from us, that we understand what needs to be overcome, we understand what we have in common. And that faculty for listening is one that, particularly in the modern media world, has been drowned out. I was brought up in an acoustic world where people talked and guitarists played acoustic guitar. If you were Brandenburg last night, you didn't have to be. You could actually be up in Prenzlauer Berg and probably hear what was going on there, because in the new electronic world, it's a world of noise. It's a world where you can't really listen because your ears are overwhelmed, our sight is overwhelmed, fast cuts on television overwhelmed, so that those critical capacities to see and to hear and to listen that allow us to appreciate others, see the world around us. I mean, studying abroad is great, but most of it's cultural tourism. People don't really see and hear and listen where they go and they kind of see the sights and enjoy it and they tell about their adventures and so on. But are they having more than a cultural tourist experience? And if they are to have that, it means they have to really know how to listen and see. And many of our students simply don't know how to do that. You made this point so well, one of the points of learning other languages is that when you learn another language, the first thing you have to do is not learn to talk it, because it's fairly easy to do that, but to learn to hear it, to listen. And that's very hard, as we all know. You often get the rudimentary of how to speak a language, but you have no idea what the other people are saying. And that forces you to listen carefully. So language training, to me, is important, not just because it gives you just a cultural window, it does that, because it's one way to learn to listen. Another crucial thing for listening is the arts. The arts are important to curriculum, not just in their own right, because they play a crucial role, but they help us see. They help us listen, if they're taught right. They encourage imagination. If democracy and the arts share one faculty, it's imagination. Arts push us to imagine. Artists are imaginers, creativity, innovation, imagination. In democracy, imagination is what gives us the capacity to see across boundaries and borders to others. The whole notion of an other suggests a lack of imagination. A bigot is a person without imagination. You see someone out there, they're different. They're different because you lack the imagination to see that we're not different, to understand what you have in common. And imagination, therefore, is absolutely crucial in a democracy. And if you want to see what a nation of bigots looked like, find a nation whose citizens have no imagination. What the Nazis lacked above all was imagination, which allowed them to exterminate other races because they weren't us. I'm sure most Nazis would react very sensitively to someone stepping on the toe of a little child or saying something unkind to their wife, very sensitive. But their sensitivity didn't extend to other races because they weren't human, they weren't like us. And to think that other human beings are not human takes a powerful absence of imagination. Or to put it differently, it takes a powerful presence of imagination to understand that the other is another version of ourselves. And so interdependence as a political project and a civic project really depends on imagination, which is why, for me, like language training, the arts have a central place in any curriculum, particularly for engineers and businessmen and lawyers. Here, here. That's where it belongs, and that's where we need it. Second, faculty.
Do you consider mathematics to be an art? Or
Yes.
science?
Can be. It depends on how it's taught.
For me, really, it was an art, so I studied
Although
theoretical physics.
now Plato, on the other hand, thought that that mathematics was the science and believed that the arts corrupted us. So it depends on who your source is on these questions. But I yield to you. If mathematics is your art, that's beautiful. That's very nice. Just let me mention two others and then stop. Two other faculties that I think are important. The second is we tend to organize education around hierarchical learning. Students talking to professors, professors talking to students. I mentioned Tocqueville's notion of the apprenticeship of liberty, and apprenticeship is a lovely word, but it implies a hierarchy. And that is a powerful part of learning. As you rightly say, democracy requires leadership, and so does education. But what doesn't happen enough in our education institutions is lateral, horizontal communication, communication among students. I used to teach in a big course at Rutgers University and then at the University of Maryland. I had about 400 students. And they would sit patiently and listen to me lecture for about 40 minutes. And then the last 20 minutes, I said, that's going to be for discussion and student speaking. Usually about a third of the class got up and tried to leave in the very first time around. And I said, what do you want? What are you doing? He said, oh, well, you're finished lecturing. Yeah, but your fellow students are going to talk. Yeah, we don't need to listen to that. We don't need to hear that. You're the teacher. Well, not really. Every serious educational psychologist will tell you that the best learning comes from what's called cooperative learning, people learning from one another, students learning from one another. So building into every form of education, whether it's legal education or economic education or liberal education, a cooperative element is absolutely crucial. Even in democracy now, we have lots of hierarchical places. Talk to the mayor, talk to the leader, town meetings. But we have very few places where citizens can actually talk to one another. That's what Civic Forum was, about which I spoke before in East Germany. Citizens talked to one another. They didn't want to talk to Honecker. They wanted to talk to one another. And by talking to one another, they created the civic movement that made Honecker irrelevant. And that comes to my last point, I'll stop, is leadership, which you talked about. I agree with you, leadership is essential. But there are several different types of leadership. And in a civic setting, the kind of leadership that is most important, I would call facilitating leadership. A leadership that empowers others to become involved. A leadership that makes the leader superfluous over time. A good psychoanalyst is a psychoanalyst who, in the end, the patient doesn't need. A bad one who wants to make a lot of money, keeps you there for life. He says, oh no, you can't do without me yet, you're still very troubled. You're very disturbed. A good teacher makes herself irrelevant. She doesn't matter anymore after 4 or 5 years. A bad teacher creates disciples who need the master for life, who can't imagine their own ideas in absence of the leader. So we need facilitating leadership in democracies. Gary Wills, an American writer, said we get into the most trouble in America under the presidents we love the most, because we throw ourselves at their mercy. We follow them anyway. That happened to John Kennedy. In many ways, a very interesting president, but a president who got America in a lot of trouble in Cuba and Vietnam. But he was so beloved that we were willing to follow him anywhere. Citizens need to stand on their own feet, and they need facilitating leaders who help empower them, who help give them the confidence to make their own decisions, who in effect are able to make themselves superfluous. A reporter stopped Gandhi in the 40s to talk to him, and talked to him for too long, and he said, excuse me, he said, I have to go now, I have to catch up to my followers. It's a nice idea of a leader having to catch up to his followers, but we want leaders who in effect put the followers in front, not in back, and that's what facilitating leadership does. You don't want leadership that's demagogic leadership. It seems indispensable, can't do without them. Oh my God, what are we going to do when the leader goes? The ideal leader is the one you don't even miss when he's gone. That's a hard thing to imagine, but that's the nature of democratic leadership. So there are a few: lateral communication, facilitating leadership, listening. Those are a few of the democratic arts that aren't present in any particular subject or fach, but have to be built into every form of education. And when they do, I think you then create the platform for a form of civic education that works both within nations and among nations.
Bravo.
Okay, let's take the advice. And I give the privilege to talk to you, and who's first with a question to the panelists? Same procedure, introduce yourself, and yes, the lady, and then the gentleman behind her. Do we have microphones for the questions?
Thank you very much to ICT for gathering us. As I saw that it's interesting that there is not shown what countries we are from, and it says about that the world without walls. And I have two questions. First of all, about imagination. I remember the Einstein word that imagination is more important than our skills. But skills is very important. I had a question to Dr. Joe Ritzen. In my country, first of all, I would like to say that applying to the universities, for example, United States, American universities and the UK universities are very important, for example, for applying. And looking at the ranking rates, it's easy to see that always American universities and the UK universities are in top 10. Your university, a friend of mine, for example, studying at your university, she entered this year. And it's good that I saw you. And I have a question that what you are doing to see your university in top 10. And the second question is to Benjamin Barber. As we know, a few years ago, British Council in Russia was closed. And there were some problems with Russia government and UK government. Some diplomats had to leave this country. And now you said that British Council is working in Russia again. Have there any changes? Yeah, I must have. I know I'm looking at him. Have there any changes in British Council, for example, after David Miliband coming to this country? What kind of relationship between UK and Russia exactly in education? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that question, because it does relate to many of the points which have been brought forward. How does competition work out at the moment? I think actually it is, and this was also my discussion with the Vice-Chancellors in the UK, you have benefited greatly from all the feedback you got from these awkward lists. They are awkward lists. There are hundreds of comments you can make, criticisms. But the rankings do give an excellent feedback, of course, only on the things which have been measured. But that is still relevant. So I like the emerging competition, and we have actually used it very much in our university also to look at our place. My second point is, Professor Barber asked for a number of things which should be done: ability to listen, develop that, make sure that you have operative learning. That all happens in our university, so we should be number one. Isn't it? So that was actually also your question. So why are we not yet number one? Actually, we are very surprised that we are number 116 this year in Times Higher Education Supplement, because we are only 60 years old. And that is only due to the fact that indeed we do the problem-based learning. Can we move on earlier? Well, here the president of Yonsei University in Korea said 2 years ago that he would be among the top 50 within 2 years. He didn't succeed, and now he's in trouble. So I've not made any promises here, where I have also looked at the background of why do certain universities quite well. Many of them simply because of an old reputation. I feel that old universities should be closed down, first of all, because they have a reputation which is absolutely not in line with what they perform. This is my famous dispute with the University of Leiden in my own country. Leiden actually does not live up to its reputation. But anyway, that's a different point of view. But reputation from the past plays a very important role, and is not held, I think, to the test of what are you actually doing in translating notions of new learning, modernized learning, and international learning, learning for a global citizenship. So then the second point is you notice that there's a lot about autonomy. Non-autonomous universities, and there are many in Europe, are not performing well. Universities which are held to strong government finance, government control, German universities, are absolutely almost absent in the top of any of these lists. They should change. Denmark has changed, so that's a second. That doesn't yet apply to us, because when I was the minister I changed all of that. Sorry for being so much putting it to myself, but I mentioned already to you that as a minister I wasn't sitting there for myself. I was sitting there, and that's my definition also of leadership, to just put that in between. I think leadership is undervalued in the sense leadership is taking responsibility, is being clear in your conscience why you're doing things. And I think that is a bit juxtaposed to what Professor Barber said, because I think facilitating, yes, always drawing in other people, always listening, but taking responsibility. Leadership really is undervalued. I think Mrs. Hannecott knows our joint experience in which we suffered from that. It's not easy. But then maybe our second was autonomy. The third is finance. And here, indeed, we will not be able to move quickly on, simply because of finance. We find it extremely hard to devote this 10%, and we should devote that to continuing to reflect on ourselves, and at the same time having these classes of only 12 students. So, Professor Barber, we have only 2 lecture halls, and these are for ritual purposes. There's no teaching from the professor to the students. It's all done in groups with tutors. And so in that respect, it's very expensive, but and that's where we lack the funds. So can I go along and then collect here the money to make us number 1?
So the second question is to Martin Hope.
Thank you very much for that question about UK-Russia relations. I'm not qualified to talk about the political aspects of UK-Russian relations, of course. But what I can talk about is cultural relations between the UK and Russia, which, in spite of some of the difficulties that we had when I was in Moscow, I would say are actually thriving. Of course, you won't read about this in the press, but there are some extremely strong partnership projects in place between the UK and Russia. Not so much between government organisations, but certainly civil society networks and educational institutions and cultural institutions from both countries. For example, we set up during my time there, it had started earlier, joint educational programmes whereby we have degrees which are degree programmes, university programmes, designed by UK and Russian teams of academics across a whole range of subjects. I think there are about 18 partnerships between UK and Russian universities for joint degree programmes. And these students, the first cohort of students, started these programmes a couple of years back now, doing one module in the UK and another module in Russia, and coming out with a degree which was awarded jointly by Russian and UK institutions. On the cultural side, we did a huge amount of facilitation of there was a Russian Masters exhibition which was at the Royal Academy in the UK, and we actually did a huge amount behind the scenes facilitation with the Royal Academy of this exhibition. We organised a press conference to promote it for the Russian Embassy in London, and enabled Mikhail Yefimovich Shvidkoy, who's the current presidential advisor on culture, to give a very pleasing press conference to close the Russian Masters exhibition. And likewise, Mr. Shvidkoy, again behind the scenes, helped us to take a big Turner exhibition to Moscow, which is just shown at the Pushkin Gallery. And around that, we did lots of educational programmes. In terms of youth engagement, young people, UK and Russia, I just highlight a couple of projects. Again, this goes back to Professor Barber's point about listening and learning. And on Sunday, when I talk about cultural relations, one of the key things I'll be saying is that we like to make the distinction between cultural relations, which is about mutual exchange, listening and learning from the other, trying to understand what the other, well, I say the other, which may be, but that's a common way of putting it, but listening and learning from people who are not like us, let's say, and realising that we have a lot in common, actually, rather than focusing more on what unites us than what divides us. That's certainly our definition of cultural relations, as opposed to, I would say, to cultural diplomacy, which is a bit more about trying to get other people to understand what you want them to understand, and trying to get them to understand your thinking. There's a couple of examples from UK-Russia relations. We took a group of young journalists from Westminster University who were trying to, they were focusing on Eastern Europe, and but they didn't speak any Russian, of course, and so we brought them over to Moscow. We organised, it was a bit cultural tourism, I have to say, but we're trying to create the longer term links there. We brought them over to Moscow. They went around, they went to various news agencies in Russia, and they went to Echo Moskvy, which is the independent Russian radio station. They met Mr. Benediktov, who's the head of Echo Moskvy, the legendary personality who runs that. And they spent some time with at MGU, Moscow State University Journalism Department. And they then, what they did was they learned a lot about Russia. And they realised that although Russia is depicted in the West as having basically no freedom of speech at all, no diversity of newspapers, what they actually learned was that within that restricted range of Russian media, there is actually some room for voicing dissent still, and that it's tolerated, and that there are opportunities for people to do that. And they just learned a lot about how Russia works, and it demystified Russia for them, and they came back to Westminster, and they wrote articles, blogs about their time in Russia. And that really opened their eyes, and they've gone away and told lots of other people about it as well. But likewise, we got some Russian journalism students from Moscow State University. They came over to Westminster, they went on Sky News, and they did a few things there. There's commercial television in the UK, but they also visited the BBC, some local radio, and that relationship has continued. So that's just an example of the kinds of cultural exchanges that we've been setting up, if you like, behind the scenes. These are, of course, all tolerated, really, by the government. They do their set-piece sort of arguments, antagonism on the policy level, but then behind the scenes, cultural relations can continue. And this was often the case, during in the Cold War, where cultural relations, a strong web of civil society networks that cultural relations organisations can create. Cultural relations continued, even though there was, at a political level, it was frozen. There was a thaw on the cultural side, which enabled people and societies to continue communicating with each other. And it's these civil society networks, we believe, that are actually very, very strong. It's this web of civil society organisations that stops wars happening. I mean, we talk about soft power, but there's nothing soft about cultural relations, actually. It's very, very strong. And all the people, the individual citizens that are getting involved in the kinds of programmes that we run with our analogue institutes, Goethe Institute, Alliance Française, and so on, developing the kinds of citizens that will stop the world descending into chaos, and into war again. So cultural relations, we believe, is actually, rather than a marginal activity, which is a nice to have, should actually be placed at the centre of international relations. It's a must-have. Without cultural relations, we'll be in a very dangerous place indeed.
You can tell already by the smell what is coming up next. And given what Professor Barber told us about the importance of interaction, you can also take it easy if we don't have the time to take every question which is still waiting, because there are also numerous opportunities to meet with other participants in here in the time which is not the formal panel discussion time, but I think we can have one more round, or shall I stop this here? One more? Thank you very much. So there was a gentleman in the back, and maybe we take just three together, quick, and...
Thank you very much. My name is Julius Mchunguzi. I come from Uganda, but I work with the Commonwealth Secretariat in London, which is an organization of most of the countries that were formerly related to Britain. When I was coming to this conference, I put a notice on my profile on Facebook and said I was going to a conference on the world without wars. And 100% of the responses that I've got responding to that, people, and most of them are students at universities in Africa, they are telling me, what are you talking about? What world without wars? that as far as they can see, there are walls everywhere. And so talking about the role of universities in a world without walls reminded me of an article that I read about 4 weeks ago in The Economist, which was talking about principals and presidents of universities in the UK complaining that the numbers of foreign students coming in to study at the universities this year have gone down because of the new visa requirements, the immigration regimes. Now, I know the gentleman from the British Council said he's not very keen to speak about the politics of the relation. But clearly, in a world with wars created by, the nation states, the requirements of nation states, which Professor Barber mentioned in the morning, and which the professor from North University talked about, of the context within which these universities operate, within a nation state and national rules, how can we possibly have education playing a very key role in a world which actually is not without walls, but actually has many, many more other walls, even though the Berlin Wall failed 20 years ago? Thank you.
Next is the lady first row.
Yes, here. I mean, not only are walls not falling, they're being created. Look at Israel. I think it's all very difficult. I'll tell you, I come from a small trilingual university.
Just get closer.
How do I do this?
No, it's on, but you have to get closer.
I'm a political science professor at a small trilingual university in the multilingual part of Italy that has a German-speaking minority and an Italian majority, and they speak a Latin dialect, Ladine, and so on. And I teach in a multidisciplinary program, philosophy, politics, and economics, and we have a very difficult time getting students. We have 50 places for international students, and we never get more than 1 or 2 because of all these walls. I mean, the league tables for the leading universities are such that they're not going to come to a little place they've never heard of, even though we tutor the students. We teach them in small groups. They have fabulous facilities. They can ski in 20 minutes from the campus, and so on. But I wonder, I'm very interested to hear about Maastricht. If people are taking small practical steps to try and kick these walls down, because I don't think they are. I mean, I think international competition and local competition simply builds higher walls.
One more. Lady over there.
My name is Yuka Wimhoya. I'm a German student, but actually I studied 3 years in the Netherlands, not at your university, so I can't make a qualified judgment about that. But I studied multidisciplinary, I studied internationally, and what I had from the multidisciplinary things is that I learned in 4 disciplines a bit and never got into depth. And I really must criticize that. So I'm now here at the Free University, and I learned what a university is, because I was in this skills promoting, and you have to learn things outside the university, but I didn't learn the things within the university. Universities trying this are schools, they are professional schools, and we shouldn't forget what universities are for. And what Dr. Barber said was that students have to learn from each other, but what we're doing now is establishing competition. Students don't talk together, they don't learn together because they are always fearing that they then lose their position in the market. And the Bologna process is totally awesome when we say, like, you can study all over Europe, you can study abroad, that's cool. I mean, that's really, I did that. But it is also misused. The whole process is misused to get reforms done at universities which aren't good for the universities. We should have the distinction between professional schools, learning the marketplace, and entering it, and thinking. We shouldn't forget the thinking at all. So that's my point.
Thank you very much for the questions, and we use the answers also for the final round of this panel.
Thank you very much. I think I can address all three questions from my earlier statement that I'm a performer, but I'm also a missionary. A missionary in the sense I do want to see these walls disappearing, and I realize that they are everywhere around. And I also say that there is a lot of evidence that taking these walls away can be done on the political scene. We have fought very hard to take the walls away in terms of visa. But not only in visa, sometimes also in cultural traits related to international students. We have now the largest contingent of Saudi female students. And not because we need the numbers, actually, but we have made it possible, thanks to our government, in a very difficult debate, also in Parliament, for the Saudi female students to come with a companion, a father or a brother. Now, this was a shock in the Dutch society. We are not going to go back to medieval practices. And then the debate was, so these women are not accepted anywhere else at the moment. So are they going to be without a medical education? Not invited anymore to the US, not invited to the UK, although the UK has allowed some. So this is the kind of question where, this is the dilemmas. I mean, we're talking easily about taking away walls, but it is really also a debate. It's a dilemma, and you like to talk about the particulars. The particulars are twofold. First of all, the dilemmas have to be solved one by one, and the second is, it can be done. We have easy visa regulations. So unite yourself in Italy, go with the presidents to the minister, bash him, keep him locked up in his office until the visa regulations are changed. The gentleman from Uganda sits at the other side, and he can't go to the British Foreign Office. And I mean, he would be immediately suspect and taken out as a terrorist, I'm sure. So I wouldn't advise that to you, but I would advise us to the vice chancellors. They complained also to me about the visa regulations. And I said, what the hell are you complaining to me? Go to your government and make your point felt. Now, this is a much more general point of view, which I also raised in my book. Universities have been really not determining their own fate. Fate in the sense, not in the sense of their finances, but determining their fate in what they are for and what role they can play. Now, I think I've answered the visa requirements. I've answered the lady from Italy. Now, on the substance, I find it. So I'm a missionary, but at the same time, I try very much to base myself as much in soft science, because it's not what I also present in my book. It's not very hard, but Barber's point about listening is not to the detriment of the quality of the learning in terms of the subject. So we have all the evidence that problem-based learning, I call it, sorry to use that term, that's the way we do it, but there are also other ways of doing it, in which you involve the students, in which you have the students listen to each other, does not go to the detriment. I mean, I can show you, you can look it up in the book, it will be on internet, you don't have to buy it, so it's very cheap, easily accessible, but there's a lot of study on this. So I find this amazing that so many more can be done. Universities are underutilized and are underutilizing themselves. You can learn the subject, and you can also indeed learn leadership or learn at least teamwork, and also learn problem solving, imagination put to work, because that's what problem-based learning is about. You always learn, and you learn your subject. Huh? It's well organized in a way in which at the same time you have to solve a problem.
Thank you. Martin Hope.
Yes, I'll try to deal with those quickly. On visas, it is a big issue still, and I still get calls from Moscow, even though I'm now based in Brussels, on a quite regular basis saying, I can't get a visa, can you help me? And have a word with somebody. we've had quite a few high-profile cases of people not getting visas. The visa regime has tightened up quite significantly over the last couple of years, and it's also been outsourced to an agency who, and so it's been more bureaucracy because they have very tight regulations and they tick boxes. There's not so much room, I'm afraid, for human interpretation. So you do get some quite bizarre cases of visas being refused when they're perfectly legitimate, bona fide students. But we are in dialogue with the government and the visa agency to make sure that the process for overseas students is facilitated, and we listen to feedback that we get from, we're in 110 countries. We get feedback every day from students who have problems with visas, and we do feed those back to the Foreign Office and the government. So hopefully you will see improvements over time. Competition versus collaboration on an individual level for students and on a business level. We're all facing these challenges where, take the British Council, in a sense, you could argue that we're in competition with the other cultural institutes in terms of promoting the British message and come to Britain rather than the other countries. But actually what we've realised is we have a lot more to gain by working collaboratively with our European partners. Take an example, language learning. We all want more people to learn languages. So that's the same for British Council, same for the Goethe Institute Alliance Française. So we've clubbed together now to promote language learning, to share best practice in language learning. Let's get teachers of Russian, German, French together to learn from each other, to talk together, and to get the methodologies improved so that language learning becomes a pleasurable experience for students rather than a painful one for some. So we're working, we see huge benefits in partnership working, building alliances now, and that each individual benefits a lot from what you get from that partnership. And in terms of the university in the trilingual part of Italy, I think you do have a bit of a problem there in attracting international students, and that may continue. But what we try to do is advise universities across the UK, an increasing number of universities mushrooming up all over the place now, as more and more people go to have tertiary education, and presumably if the current trends continue, you might get to a situation where 80% or 90% of people go through tertiary education. And of course, each institution wants international students to make the books balance. And so we find ourselves trying to advise the universities on a marketing strategy for how to attract international students. Well, it's not always easy to find the niche. But what we found is there will be a niche somewhere. It might be in boutique kind of courses, in specialised kind of courses. You just need to find out what your unique selling point is as an institution, and then make sure that you have an effective promotional campaign to attract students to your courses. But the best of luck with that.
Quick finish. The role of education has always been subversive on the one hand, but it also has always reflected the culture seen in the Middle Ages. It was about religion. The Renaissance began to be about civic culture. In the 18th century, it was about science, rationalism, the new emerging Enlightenment disciplines. The 19th century in America was very civically oriented. Today, understandably, it largely reflects the commercial culture in which it finds itself. In almost every way, that is to say, to some extent, education has been swallowed up by the world of consumerism and the world of commerce. Students think of themselves as consumers of education, and education is the commodity they buy. How devastating that is to the idea of liberal or civic education, you can just imagine, but in fact that's the way it is. And even good students will say, well, I'm not paying my tuition to get this kind of commodity from you, and your job here, what I'm purchasing as a consumer is this, this, and this, and you're the vendor providing the goods. We've seen in the United States specific subordination of education to universities. The big cola companies, Pepsi Cola and Cola Company, have actually bought licenses to sell only their products, which means you have no freedom of choice in those schools as to what you consume and what you buy, and students are forced to go along with it. But there's a much more dangerous thing. We haven't talked about that. We've really, in a way, had the wrong subject, because we're supposed to be talking about education, and we're talking about schools and university. That's not where education happens in the modern world. This is where education happens. This size screen, the computer screen, the silver screen, the big screens, and so on, the screens that we were watching last night where U2 was. What is a Maastricht University to U2 in terms of its ability, or U2 the group, or U2 the internet itself, Hollywood, Madison Avenue? They are what young people see 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 52 weeks a year. Education, maybe you're in school for a couple of years, in college for a couple of years, you're in primary schools for 8, 9 years, you're maybe in school 6, 7 hours a day for 30 weeks a year. But what you find on these screens, you face every day all your life. And these have such a greater influence on what we think, the paradigms we absorb, how we behave, and so forth, than anything that happens in the classroom. So maybe the next conversation we ought to have when we talk about education ought to be about what's on these screens, these little pixelated screens where young people are learning the world, understanding how to see and listen, and figure that if they know what's on these screens, they know what's in the world. That's where real education takes part. We're a marginal enterprise compared to that. And while obviously we can do something about where we teach, we need to begin to think about how to do something about the vast media operations that are entirely owned and controlled by commercial corporations whose interest is profitability and little else. We need to think of how we can either take them back for the purposes of education, subvert them, or make them again into instruments of education.